All right, guys. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Parties. These were two events that played really pivotal roles in the beginning of the American Revolution. They follow directly after the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the Townshend Act, which we talked about last week. This idea of taxation without representation. So these are important events that happened, and we're going to talk about them from a maybe less biased perspective than they get talked about quite often. Um, so, with that in mind, the Boston Massacre happens in 1770, and basically a crowd of angry colonists, probably a little bit drunk, they threaten British soldiers. This starts off as sort of just banter and yelling, um, and then throwing of snowballs. So pretty, you know, low key stuff, and then kind of gets out of control, which we see from time to time in protests. How somebody can sort of start agitation, which leads to, significant violence. We see it today in protests. So it ends with the British opening fire and killing 5 Americans. And what's interesting is that the first American killed in the Boston Massacre, who's often credited as the first American killed in the American Revolution, was a man named Crispus Attucks. He was a person of color, I believe he was a black man, and he was the first American killed in the American Revolution, which holds sort of an ironic, tragic notion. Um, so these soldiers, there's a lot of conflicting reports. Some say that the Americans ended up going from throwing snowballs to throwing like rocks and glass at them. Some say that the British, one of the soldiers slipped and pulled the trigger by accident. Um, there's probably a little bit of truth on both sides. And the result though is 5 Americans being killed, and it's a huge PR disaster, a public relations nightmare. Americans really draw these horrific paintings and put them all over the newspapers, as we have an example of here. The event was likely not this at all. This was probably more accidental than anything. But the imagery is pure propaganda, and it's kind of shows how powerful colonial propaganda was, which I think is really cool. Um, Parliament cancels the Townshend Acts to try to limit the blowback of what's happening in the American colonies. The British soldiers do get tried in a colonial court in Boston. John Adams, who becomes our second president, he actually defends them. He's a lawyer, and he doesn't defend the British soldiers because he likes them particularly, but he believes that everybody should have their day in court. Everybody has a right to a fair trial. He believes in law, and that's really important because I think it's something that the American judicial system later on really tries to strive for. We don't get it right all the time. Some people might say we don't get it right a lot of the time, but it's something that we kind of make a foundational principle of. Boston Tea Party is also going to happen around this time in 1773. So the British were, we talked about how the British were going after smugglers, and they were heavily taxing any tea that was sold outside of um, Britain's monopolies, so that they could keep the price where they wanted to on tea. But there was still a lot of smuggling going on, so the British figured, hey, we're going to undercut the price on tea drastically for a short amount of time to just absolutely destroy the business for these smugglers, because the smugglers bought the tea for something and then need to sell it for more. So they say, hey, we're going to undercut, the the living daylights out of them and kill their businesses. And this creates unrest for a lot of different reasons, because the smugglers don't want to lose money, but also they see this as being like purposeful, the colonists. So a bunch of colonists dress up as some Mohawk Indians, and they board the 3 ships in Boston Harbor, which were named the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Not important, but I just think naming a ship the Beaver, being the captain of the Beaver, would be kind of cool. So the colonists board the tea ships and they throw the tea into the harbor, into the Boston Harbor. It was 342 cases of tea, and this isn't universally loved by the revolutionary forces. A lot of people act like this was a big rallying cry and everyone was cheering about it, but Ben Franklin specifically said that the Americans should have to pay the British back for the tea because he didn't believe in the destruction of private property, of property. And I think this is interesting because when we look at protests today, like for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, or Antifa movements, or even, the January 6th riots, there's a lot of question about whether or not destruction of property hurts the cause of a movement. And I think it's just kind of interesting. We're going to talk about that in class. But I think it's interesting that the same question got raised in 1773 that we're still asking today. I think that's kind of interesting. And John Adams writes prolifically during this. If you're ever interested in reading primary sources about the Tea Party, John Adams writes a lot about what happened during the American Revolution era. This ends up turning into the Intolerable Acts. So obviously the king needs to kind of, he needs to drop the hammer, on America. So he closes the port of Boston for obvious reasons, I think, after the Tea Party. And he bans town hall meetings. And that's important because you got to remember, during the Revolutionary era, there's no TikTok, there's no Facebook, there's no other way to communicate with people other than, reading newspapers, sending letters, which, had stamp taxes in this era, and then also going to town hall meetings. And another thing about this was that town meetings was kind of a way that militias organized and mustered. And that became an issue too, because American colonists felt they had a right to muster and have militias available to protect themselves, which becomes important for our Second Amendment rights later on. But the British officials who are in trouble are going to be sent to Great Britain for trial following the Intolerable Acts. And this is really a death blow to the idea of kind of like judicial autonomy in America. The idea that Americans can, enact justice. And during those Boston Massacre trials of the British soldiers, John Adams, our second president, he, as a lawyer, defended, like we said, the British soldiers, and he got them acquitted in a colonial court. So he got a colonial jury to acquit, to find them innocent. And that was seen as justice prevailing in those courts. And the British responded to it by saying that they wouldn't allow colonials to have those kinds of courts. So John Adams saw that as a big slap in the face. So this is going to lead up to the First Continental Congress, which was what we're going to talk about a little more this coming week. We're going to finish the week with a mock First Continental Congress. We're going to be talking a little bit about the grievances of the colonies and how the different colonies reacted. So the more of this that you guys are reading and watching, the easier it's going to be, because then we're going to follow up with the Second Continental Congress. We want to do these fun mock congresses as opposed to like a lot of lecture. So hopefully you guys can just watch this or just kind of play it in the background when you're at home, and then in class we can have fun and do a lot of discussion and stuff like that. So if you guys have any questions, just grab me after class. I'm happy to help. So thank you guys. Well, and I'll see you in class.